When jazz went off the deep end of instrumental complexity and virtuosity in the 1950s, the American public turned their attention to forms undeniably more simple but arguably more emotionally strained. After jazz faded out of the mainstream, R&B and soul served as the main form of representation of Black American music in popular culture until the invention of hip-hop. In the post-war era, rock and roll was seen as the emphasis of energy at the expense of everything else. But soul music was able to evade that characterization by including some of the trappings of earlier forms of music, like blues, jazz, and gospel. Today, we're talking about one of the most significant recordings from the first wave of soul, Otis Blue, Otis Redding Sings Soul by Otis Redding. It's fair to characterize soul music as the culmination of a spiritual musical tradition which started on American plantations during the era of slavery. Enslaved people brought to the United States from Africa were required not to speak to one another while working, and they were especially required not to speak their native languages. But they were allowed to sing, so they developed these call-and-response forms of music called field hollers, which conveyed critical pieces of information, helped them vent emotions about the situation they were in, and just helped them pass the time. These songs often included a request for food, water, rest, or freedom, and they were often at least partially improvised, which makes it really hard for us now to know exactly what they might have sounded like. Later recordings of remembered melodies actually suggest that these hollers sounded pretty similar to Muslim calls of prayer in the West African tradition, and while we don't have a definitive causal link there, it's reasonable to think that there is something there, that these enslaved people were remembering these calls to prayer from their homeland and incorporating them into a song style which was permitted by the plantation owners. Because of language restrictions, a lot of these songs were actually initially wordless. And notably, when compared to later forms of call and response music, most of these were formulated as one caller calling out on their own, being responded by everyone in earshot. Later on, spirituals took this formula and made it explicitly religious. Spirituals often directly quoted snippets from the Bible, especially Psalms, but oftentimes other verses. Unsurprisingly, this mode of expression was explicitly endorsed by slave owners. It was considered a means to provide a religious education to people who were deliberately kept illiterate by the landowning elite. Now, we actually have a pretty good idea of what these sounded like because they endured as a form of popular music into the era of the earliest musical recordings. And unsurprisingly, those Bible stories were often coded messages, continuing to convey that yearning for freedom. From early on in American slavery, drums were banned on plantations. So a lot of the percussion for this music was a series of claps and stomps. But if you look at the rhythms here, you can easily trace their lineage directly back to the rhythmic traditions of music in West Africa. Now, spirituals were actually an early form of what would later become known as black gospel music, and later iterations of this genre would accumulate a canon of standardized songs instead of constantly improvising like was common all the way through the era of spirituals. Gospel standards crossed over into white communities through the broadly interracial movement of Pentecostal churches in the United States, and gospel played a large role in the civil rights movement, often spread by these same churches which were at the helm of the movement in the American South. And gospel music is still absolutely in heavy popular use today. And now we finally get to soul music, which arose from a combination of gospel music and R&B to create a huge mass market success that defined the post-war era. Despite its religious roots, soul music often used secular lyrics, but it oftentimes retained the call and response structure. Soul music was self-consciously wrapped up in black identity from the beginning. It purposefully incorporated elements from each of these successive forms of traditional black American music, and it oftentimes advocated for social justice in its lyrics and themes. And while soul developed alongside rock and roll, soul music was much more likely to adhere to the more traditional elements of rhythm and blues, and it also incorporated a jazz influence which was much more rarely seen in rock and roll. It's also worth mentioning here the origins of the term R&B, which stands for rhythm and blues. This term was initially a form of record company jargon to refer to an album which was created by a black band for a primarily black audience. However, it grew in association with a certain style, a certain form of blues which used very little improvisation, had an intense focus on the drum kit, and had a mostly string-based instrumental lineup along with the piano. Now, while the lines are a little bit blurry, there were differences between R&B and rock and roll. For instance, R&B oftentimes included a saxophone and more politically charged lyrics. But over time, those two genres would come to be closely associated. And of course, R&B would later change connotations into the ballad-heavy pop-influenced style that we know today. And now on to Otis Redding himself. This might come as a surprise initially, but he actually cites his most significant early influence as Little Richard. We'll get to why this makes sense in a minute, but for now let's talk about his early life. When he was 15, his dad got tuberculosis, and Otis Redding had to take on odd jobs in order to support his family while his dad was sick. Redding developed a style with a much more intense focus on slow tempos and balladry. And while he was always promoted with branding as a soul artist from the beginning, he almost considered himself more closely associated with R&B and rock and roll, which just goes to show how porous these labels were at the time. And now on to the content of the album. The front half of the album is a mix of songs originally written by Redding for this record and songs which were written by contemporary soul artist Sam Cooke. These songs dig deep into those blues tropes of unrequited love and a longing for equality, but they also evoke religious themes and aesthetics that we see in black gospel music. Notably on this first half, I'll draw your attention to Respect, which was written by Otis Redding for this album and was later repopularized by Aretha Franklin. Originally here, it was written for Redding to air out grievances against a woman, which Aretha Franklin subverted into becoming a feminist anthem. The second half features covers of popular songs, most notably Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones, and Redding's rendition of this song shows him at his most emotionally vulnerable. He goes absolutely out of control with his vocal performance. It's an absolute must listen and a huge takeaway from the album. The instrumentation here includes a standard rock and roll setup alongside saxophones and a trumpet. These horns mostly play jazzy licks that play a similar role as backgrounds do in a jazz solo. They help tie the music together and push those choruses forward as the slow tempos might seem like they're pulling it back. But of course, the vocals here demand a singular attention from open to close. They command an intensity and an energy that transcends the album's slower tempos. And you can tell they push the limits of Redding's range and ability in every aspect, which of course makes this a really easy point for you to see that influence from rock and roll and particularly Little Richard. And it's that juxtaposition of extreme energetic vocal performances and more laid-back surroundings that showcases the interplay between rock and roll and soul music at the time. These constant absolute vocal meltdowns have a special way of making the compositions feel lonely, even though they're played in an ensemble. So many of us have been in Redding's shoes before. People around us in our lives may sympathize with us and even play the same tune, but they'll never understand that intensity eating away at our insides. We've circled all the way back around here to those call and response traditions, with the horns answering pleas from the vocals and the guitar solos, while the remainder of the rhythm section forms the surrounding environment. However, this entire work reminds us of how the blues are held within each soul individually, universally understandable, but always carried separately.